I did want to say that the workshop's made possible by a grant from the Department of Justice and Attorney General, particularly the Office for Women and Violence Prevention. So we thank them very much for that. So a couple of key points for today. One thing we really wanted to make clear, certainly from our perspective, that each case and each family is really unique. Understanding the dynamics of violence in each particular case is really vital to preventing violence in the future. Certainly patterns emerge if you're working with perpetrators or victims of domestic violence on a regular basis, but sometimes assuming that those patterns are present in a particular case can lead to you really getting it wrong. And if we're trying to prevent violence in the future, what we really need to know is what's causing it now. And once you understand that, you can work with the families. Collaboration between service providers can lead to better outcomes for families. That's something that we find in our work that works really well, but a lot of the way that systems are work make that very difficult. So obviously victims have the right to confidentiality, likewise with perpetrators. A lot of the services that are working with perpetrators don't always have involvement with the victim. So that's one thing that we're trying to change, because when you have all the pieces of a jigsaw, you're going to get a clearer picture of what's happening and be able to work better with those families. Both victims and perpetrators need to be involved in a trauma-informed way. Most of the family law matters that I've been involved in have some aspect of trauma, whether it's the chronic stress from family violence or childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences, making sure that we're aware that often both parties, or at least one of the parties, may have trauma is really important. Matters are often really complex with many factors involved. And finally, practitioner self-care is really critical. You've got to fit your own oxygen mask first, because if you're not looking after yourself, you're not going to be the best for your clients. And that's something that I think Bev and I find, that you can be in a really stressful job and you're dealing with sometimes quite difficult clients, and it's easy to become stressed out ourselves. And if we're stressed out, we're not being the best for the clients that we're working with. So you have to make sure you're looking after yourself as much as everybody else. So one of the things I wanted to do today is really challenge you all to change the way that you think about the impacts of domestic violence, because it's easy to think that, there's physical violence is going to have injuries, broken arms, things like that, and we might know that being in a domestic violence relationship can cause depression and anxiety. But in fact, there's a lot of really long impacts of domestic violence and chronic stress, both for children and for adults. And we're going to be talking a lot about that today. So hopefully after today, you'll be aware of all those short and long-term impacts, if you're not already. So in your little workshop show bag, there is a sheet called Myths of Domestic Violence. And some of those we will be going through today, but I just wanted to touch on a few points now, so that hopefully you can think about. There we go. The first one, the question that I would ask is, can or does psychological abuse and coercive control have a greater impact than physical abuse? And spoiler abuse is absolutely it can. There's so much research coming out now that many victims say it's that psychological or emotional abuse that caused them the biggest impact and has the long-term impacts. Unfortunately, whilst the court is recognising that emotional abuse and psychological abuse can have an impact, it's still hard work with the courts to get them to recognise that. They have these different lists now, for example, the EVIT list, where they look at, where someone might be in a serious risk, and they certainly look at physical violence. We're still struggling to get them to recognise the really serious impacts of coercive control or emotional control. That's the one where it's still a bit of a struggle with a lot of the courts. Another question, is a person's past trauma relevant to their experience of domestic violence? Absolutely, yes. Most of the families we deal with have some element of trauma, either in the recent relationship or past relationship, or both, D, all of the above. So when we're approaching a family, we can't just look at the situation of what's happened recently. We really have to get a full history of what's been going on in their life so we can understand the dynamics in their life. Another question, Can a person's experience of domestic violence impact their ability to give instructions or evidence in court? Absolutely, yes. And in your little workshop, bag of tricks in the envelope, I've put in there the family violence best practice principles, which are guidelines for lawyers and judges when they've got matters in the family court. And you'll see on page 16 and 17, they talk about victims as vulnerable witnesses. And what we know is that when somebody's in a chronic state of stress, that can really affect their memory. It can affect their ability to give evidence in a chronological way. They might be in a shut-down state. They might be in a hyper-aroused state. And all of these things can affect not only how they can give evidence to me, give evidence in court, but appear credible to the court. And often domestic violence happens behind closed doors, where it's only the parties who were there. So the court has to look at, the credibility of both of the parties. And if you've got a client who presents in a way that judges think is not credible, that can be really difficult for them to be believed. So we often, as lawyers, have to think, how do we get evidence before the court about how their trauma might be affecting the way they present, and what else can we do about that? Sometimes it can be really helpful to get other evidence to back up what they're saying, and that might be text messages or subpoenaing documents and things like that. And that's one where service providers like yourself can play a really important role by not only working with victims and perpetrators and validating maybe not their behaviour but their experiences and their feelings, but also helping them to work out what other evidence might be available if they're involved in court proceedings to give to their lawyers. Because often there's a real difficulty with victims being believed, and it shouldn't be that way, but the reality is that's how it is for a lot of victims. So if you can also turn your mind to how you might be able to support their credibility, that can be really helpful. Another question is, can domestic violence impact a person's parenting capacity? Absolutely, yes. And one of the resources that I've put on your list of resources is a book. Maternal Depression Can Undermine the Development of Young Children by the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child. They're an organisation, their material is published out of Harvard, but it's a multidisciplinary, university collaboration with lots of world experts in their field writing about how things impact children. And they've done lots of studies on how maternal depression and a mother's ability to relate to her child can in fact affect the development of the child. And of course we know people who've experienced domestic violence often have depression, anxiety and a lot of things like that. So it's really important to be able to work with those parents to help them overcome the problems that they can have so it's not affecting their children. So anyway, that's a really good resource if you haven't seen it before. One of the problems that victims often have in the court is one of the things that the courts look at when determining who a child should live with is a parent's parenting capacity. But of course, sometimes that is affected by domestic violence and trauma. So someone who's been through all of this is then having it held against them because that's affecting their parenting capacity. So one of the things that the Australian Law Reform Commission has recognised is that's a really perverse situation, that's held against them. So there's a bill out at the moment called the Family Law Reform Act 2023, and that's one of the recommendations to be changed in that act, is that the whole section 60cc that sets out what the court takes into account when determining what's in a child's best interests has been changed. And they're looking at not just the parenting capacity, but is that parent willing to use services to assist them with their capacity? And that's particularly one of the things that's aimed at is people who've experienced trauma. So it's not held against them. Another thing that is actually, while I'm on the amendments, is at the moment when you look at what a court takes into account in children's matters, is the need to protect a child from domestic violence and abuse, but not a parent. And so as much as the courts say, look, we really take domestic violence seriously, when they're looking at what's in a child's best interests, they don't look at protecting a parent. Or it's subject to the best interests of the child. Of course, they take it into account, but it's subject to the child's best interests, and that can be a really big problem. So another one of the amendments is not only the safety of the child, but a parent who has the care of the child. And I think that's a really big change. That's a really important thing that hopefully will be passed. Another question, can a mother's experience of emotional abuse or coercive control when pregnant impact her unborn child? Not just physically abuse, because we know if someone's punched in the stomach and they're pregnant, obviously that can be really bad, but can a mother's chronic stress affect her unborn baby? And absolutely yes. Yes, it can. And we'll be talking more about epigenetics and genetics later on. I get really passionate about talking about all of that. But that's another thing the courts just aren't recognising when these mums or any parent. But if you're pregnant and you're under chronic stress, that can have huge implications for your child. Much higher risks of diabetes, autism, learning disabilities and the like. And we're still trying to get the courts to make sure they recognise that as an impact of domestic violence. Another question, can a child's experience of domestic violence have long-term impacts on her physical and mental health throughout her lifetime? And of course it can. And there's some more resources in your little show bags about this. So one of them I've put in there is connecting the brain to the rest of the body. Early childhood development and lifelong health are deeply intertwined. So another really good resource. And early experiences can alter gene expression and affect long-term development. So another really good resource that we're going to be covering some of the stuff in there later on. So just as I'm talking through all of these, I just want you to be thinking that, and I know you guys are all experts in what you do, so I'm probably preaching to the converted, but domestic violence is not just about physical harm or about the short-term risks. It can have really long-term impacts on children and parents that sometimes can last for years. And a lot of the children that have experienced a lot of adverse childhood experiences, including domestic violence, end up to be the adults that we see in the family court many years later. And so whilst it's easy to blame and shame, a perpetrator of domestic violence, when you're starting to think about why is that person acting that way, and you think about what they went through as a child, and you know what all of this can have on a child's development, this is what the impact is many years later, is this behaviour that we see.